Welcome back to the Earth in Upheaval series. I'm sorry it's taken so long to get round to this, but there have been so many other avenues that needed exploring. Now this is the third part in this series, and in this part we will be exploring the chapter on erratic boulders, discussing the main concepts in the chapter, as well as looking at the sources Velikovsky used and whether there is any additional papers that might help shed light on this topic. An erratic boulder or rock is found in a location where, geologically speaking, it did not originate. So something natural has transported the rock or boulder from one place to another. They come in many different shapes and sizes, and some are truly colossal in size. Discussing the most massive of these, Velikovsky quotes G. F. Wright, who mentions a mass chalk near Malmö in Sweden, 3 miles long and 1,000 feet wide, and around 100 to 200 feet in thickness. Even larger than this, we find a megablock in Canada which measures 38 kilometers long by 30 kilometers wide and up to 100 meters in thickness. Erratics were first discussed in the late 18th century by the Swiss geologist Horace de Saussure. He had noticed that the southern slopes of the Jura Mountains were covered with many boulders which did not match the geology of its mountains. Instead, they matched the rocks from the Alps. On the agent that had moved these blocks, Saussure was very clear. The water was this agent cannot in the least be doubted, because these stones, both large and small, are found deposited on horizontal ridges mixed with sand and gravel, just as water transported them. For if one sees one of these fragments exposed on a rock, inspection of the site alone clearly demonstrates that rainwater or meltwater had carried off the lightest pieces, which formerly surrounded these large masses. The waters rushed towards these abysses with extreme violence, proportionate to the height they then had, hollowed out deep valleys, and carried immense quantities of earth, sand, and fragments of all kinds of rock. These semi-liquid masses, driven out by the weight of the water, accumulated to the height where we can still see several of these scattered fragments. Saussure never considered that the boulders or rocks could have been transported by ice. He was convinced that the round nature of their surfaces was proof that water was responsible. Nowadays it is believed that most of these erratics were deposited by glaciers. We will examine some of the more recent articles that may point to an alternative later on. The first to mention the idea of these boulders being deposited by ice sheets was a Scottish geologist, James Hutton, in his Theory of Earth published in 1795. He suggested that the Alps used to have valleys of ice sliding down in all directions towards the lower country, and it was in this ice that large blocks of granite were slowly carried great distances. So once more we see two different stories based on either gradualist and the slow change of the earth versus the catastrophist who saw many of the scars and littered boulders as a sign of one of the many catastrophes that had befallen Earth. Velikovsky then paints a picture showing how widespread these erratic boulders are. He uses Richard Foster Flint to reference 3 large erratics: the Madison Erratic near Conway, New Hampshire, the Ototox erratics near Calgary, Alberta, and a large mass of Silurian limestone in Warren County, Ohio. He then uses the American geologist George Frederick Wright to reference 4 more erratics: Mohegan Rock in Montville, Connecticut, the Silurian limestone in Warren County, Ohio, the Malmö chalk in Sweden, and a similar mass of chalk in England. He finally quotes the Irish Ernest Shackleton and his Atlantic expedition of 1907 to 1909, where there were a couple of photographs of large granite erratics on the slopes of Mount Erebus. Further analysis of Velikovsky's sources reveals that there are some parts of his text that are left unquoted, and these include his reference to the British Isles, where he quotes on the shores and in the highlands are enormous quantities of them transported across the North Sea from the mountains of Norway. He also mentions, from Scandinavia boulders are carried to Germany and spread over that country and in some places so thickly that it seems as though they have been brought there by a mason to build cities. It is unclear in both cases where he got this material from. But I was able to track down some interesting work regarding the British Isles, which we will discuss in a little bit. What is odd about this chapter is that it never makes any specific conclusions. He just establishes the existence and outlines how widespread the erratic boulders are. So what else can we find in more modern publications referring to erratic boulders? Current theories tell us that erratic boulders are deposited by glaciers which transport them hundreds, if not thousands of miles. But there are plenty of erratic boulders that are recognized as being caused by flooding, and one of the largest occurred not far from Tonga. These erratic boulders were hurled up onto the island by one of the largest tsunamis. By analysing the erratic boulders and examining the coral material on them, they were able to determine that this event occurred about 120,000 years ago. In a related paper, other scientists have shown that water does have the power to move some of the largest erratic boulders. Now, returning to the British Isles, I was able to dig up some very interesting facts. The origin of these boulders are shrouded in mystery. Mainstream geologists generally try and ignore the widespread distribution of erratic boulders in southern England, because there is no credible evidence that the ice sheets travelled this far south. When we examine the different types of erratic boulders, there is one type that is all too often overlooked: sarsen stone erratic boulders. Mainstream sources generally try and place scant attention to these types of boulders. When we examine the 7 counties in southern England that are acknowledged to contain sarsen stones, they display no signs of a glacial past. When Steve Marshall examined the sarsen stones, he showed that it is an extremely hard and brittle form of sandstone, cemented by silica. It is found typically in the bottom of dry valleys, where it lies scattered in large drifts and trains. When we examine the distribution of these stones on the Wiltshire Downs, this also suggests a water-driven pattern with flooding fans across East Anglia and South East England. Now, it comes as no surprise that flooding on this scale is unfamiliar in mainstream terms in England. When we examine the erratics in Essex, we also see that these contain an amazing variety of different erratics that have been transported from distant locations. If this was caused by flooding, we would also expect trees to have been shredded and deposited in this material. When you examine the gravel in Essex, you will also find large pieces of silicified fossil wood. These are sometimes large enough to reveal the growth rings. The source of this fossil wood and its age has never been established. As always, be brave, be curious, the truth is waiting for us. Until next time.